The emergency room at Seattle General Hospital had seen everything, but what happened on that rainy Tuesday night in November would leave the entire medical staff questioning everything they thought they knew about human communication. A 12-year-old boy who hadn't spoken a single word in his entire life would finally break his silence, but the person he chose to speak to, and the 3 words he said, would expose a truth so shocking that it would destroy one of the city's most powerful families and change multiple lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Ashworth pressed his Italian leather shoes against the polished marble floor of his downtown Seattle penthouse, watching the city lights blur through floor-to-ceiling windows as rain streaked down the glass. At 45, he commanded a real estate empire worth over $200 million, owned properties across 3 states, and could buy anything money could purchase. Except the one thing he wanted most, to hear his son speak. 12-year-old Dylan Ashworth sat in the corner of their sprawling living room, methodically arranging colored blocks in perfect geometric patterns. The boy's dark hair fell across his forehead as he worked with the same precision that had baffled doctors, specialists, and therapists for over a decade. Dylan wasn't deaf. He could hear perfectly. He wasn't intellectually disabled. His IQ tested well above average. He simply chose not to speak, and no amount of money, therapy, or pleading had changed that fact. Marcus had spent countless nights wondering what his son's voice would sound like. Would it be high and childlike? Or deeper than expected? Would Dylan call him Dad or Father? These questions haunted him more than any business deal ever could. "The car is ready, Mr. Ashworth," announced Patricia Chen, their live-in nanny and Dylan's primary caregiver. She'd been with the family for 8 years, ever since Dylan's mother, Rebecca, had died in a car accident when Dylan was 4. Patricia was one of the few people who seemed to truly understand the boy, communicating with him through gestures, drawings, and an intuitive connection that Marcus envied. Dylan looked up from his blocks at the sound of Patricia's voice, his intelligent green eyes, so much like his mother's, scanning the room before settling on his father. Marcus felt that familiar pang of hope and disappointment. For a moment, he thought Dylan might speak, might say something, anything. Instead, the boy simply stood and walked to the coat closet, retrieving his navy blue jacket with the efficiency of someone much older. They were heading to Seattle General Hospital for Dylan's monthly appointment with Dr. Sarah Williams, a pediatric neurologist who had been working with Dylan for 3 years. Williams whispered, leaning closer to examine the drawing. The level of detail, the perspective. "Dylan, this is truly remarkable work." Dylan looked up at her, and for just a moment, Marcus thought he saw his son's lips part as if he might speak. Instead, Dylan returned to his drawing, adding more figures to his paper city. The appointment proceeded like all the others: physical examinations, cognitive tests, attempts at various communication exercises. Dylan participated with his usual quiet cooperation, following instructions through gestures and actions rather than words. Marcus watched every moment, hoping for a breakthrough that never came. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Williams pulled Marcus aside. "I want to try something different next month," she said, keeping her voice low. "There's a new therapy approach that focuses on environmental triggers rather than direct communication pressure. Sometimes children like Dylan are waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right circumstances." "The right person?" Marcus asked, confused. Sometimes breakthrough moments happen with unexpected individuals, people outside the family circle, outside the medical establishment, someone who represents safety or trust in a way that's different from what Dylan experiences daily. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure he understood. Dylan had been around hundreds of people: doctors, therapists, teachers, family friends. If the right person existed, surely they would have appeared by now. They took the elevator down to the main floor, Dylan walking between Marcus and Patricia with his characteristic quiet composure. The hospital's evening shift was just beginning, and the corridors buzzed with activity. Nurses heading to their stations, doctors making rounds, visitors coming and going. As they passed through the main lobby, Dylan suddenly stopped walking. Marcus nearly bumped into him, surprised by the abrupt halt. Dylan was staring across the lobby toward the information desk, where a maintenance worker was replacing burned-out light bulbs in the overhead fixtures. The man was probably in his 60s, with weathered hands and gray hair visible beneath a worn baseball cap. His uniform bore the name Frank Rodriguez, embroidered above the left pocket. He worked methodically, replacing each bulb with the careful attention of someone who took pride in doing things right, even when no one was watching. Something about the maintenance worker seemed to captivate Dylan. The boy took 3 steps toward the man, then stopped, looking back at his father with an expression Marcus had never seen before. Not confusion or withdrawal, but something that looked almost like recognition. Frank Rodriguez finished with the light fixture and began gathering his tools. As he bent to pick up his toolbox, he noticed Dylan watching him. Instead of the polite nod most adults gave when they noticed the silent boy, Frank smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that seemed to bridge the distance between them. "Evening, son," Frank said simply, his voice carrying a warmth that somehow made the busy hospital lobby feel smaller and more intimate. Dylan continued staring at the maintenance worker, and Marcus felt Patricia's hand gently touch his arm. She'd noticed it too, the way Dylan seemed frozen in place, the intensity of his focus, the subtle change in his posture that suggested something significant was happening. Frank Rodriguez shouldered his toolbox and started walking toward the service elevator. As he passed by Dylan, he paused again, looking down at the boy with the same easy smile. "You take care of yourself, young man," Frank said, and there was something in his tone, a gentleness, a lack of expectation or pressure, that seemed to reach Dylan in a way that years of professional intervention had not. What happened next would replay in Marcus Ashworth's memory every day for the rest of his life. Dylan's lips moved for the first time in 12 years. 3 words emerged, barely above a whisper, but crystal clear in the hospital lobby's ambient noise. "Help me, Frank." The toolbox slipped from Frank Rodriguez's weathered hands, crashing to the marble floor with a metallic clang that echoed through the space. Screwdrivers and light bulbs scattered across the polished surface, but Frank didn't notice. His face had gone completely white, as if he'd seen a ghost. Marcus felt his legs weaken. Patricia gasped, her hand flying to cover her mouth. Several people in the lobby turned to look at the commotion, but none of them understood they had just witnessed what dozens of medical professionals had deemed impossible. "Dylan?" Marcus whispered, kneeling beside his son. "Did you just—" But Dylan wasn't looking at his father. His green eyes remained fixed on Frank Rodriguez, who had taken several steps backward, his face a mixture of shock and something else, something that looked almost like fear. "I don't understand," Frank stammered, his voice shaking. "How does he know my name? I've never seen this kid before in my life." Patricia moved closer to Dylan, her training as a caregiver overriding her amazement. She knew that this moment, however miraculous, needed to be handled carefully. "Dylan, sweetheart, can you tell us what you mean?" Dylan's mouth opened again, and more words came, halting as if he were learning to use his voice for the first time. The man in the basement, the one who couldn't breathe, Frank was there. The color drained completely from Frank's face. He looked around the lobby frantically, as if searching for an escape route. "I need to go," he muttered, bending to gather his scattered tools with trembling hands. "My shift's over. I need to go home." But Marcus was faster. Years of high-stakes business negotiations had taught him to recognize when someone was hiding something crucial. He stood and gently but firmly placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. "Please," he said. "My son hasn't spoken a word in 12 years. Not one word. And the first thing he says is your name. There has to be a reason." Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Frank straightened slowly, his eyes darting between Marcus, Dylan, and the growing crowd of curious onlookers. "Mr. Ashworth, I know who you are. Everyone in this hospital knows who you are. But I swear on my mother's grave I've never met your boy before tonight." "Then how does he know you were in a basement with someone who couldn't breathe?" Patricia asked, her voice gentle but insistent. Frank's toolbox crashed to the floor again, this time because his hands were shaking too badly to hold it. The question had hit him like a physical blow. He stared at Dylan with growing horror, as if the 12-year-old boy had just revealed his deepest, darkest secret. "That's impossible," Frank whispered. "That happened 30 years ago, before your son was even born." The lobby had grown quieter, with people pretending not to listen while straining to hear every word. Marcus realized they needed privacy. "There's a conference room on the 3rd floor," he said. "Dr. Williams uses it for family meetings. We need to talk." Frank shook his head vigorously. No, no, I can't. I won't. This is some kind of trick, some kind of setup. Rich people like you think you can manipulate anyone, make anyone dance to your tune. Frank, Dylan said, his young voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible. She's still down there, in the cold place. She's been waiting. Frank Rodriguez collapsed into a nearby chair, as if his legs could no longer support him. His weathered face crumpled, and Marcus saw tears forming in the older man's eyes. Jesus Christ, Frank whispered. How can he possibly know about Maria? The name hung in the air like a confession. Patricia immediately pulled out her phone, stepping away from the group to make a call. Marcus recognized the move. She was contacting Dr. Williams, who would need to know about this unprecedented development in Dylan's case. Who is Maria? Marcus asked, sitting in the chair across from Frank. Frank looked up at him with hollow eyes. My sister. She died when she was 7 years old. 31 years ago this December. Dylan moved closer to Frank, showing no fear despite the man's obvious distress. She fell through the ice at the construction site, the one where they were building the new apartments on Pike Street. You were supposed to watch her, but you were smoking cigarettes behind the equipment shed with your friends. Frank's sob echoed through the lobby. Stop, he pleaded. Please, kid, just stop. But Dylan continued, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each word. When you heard her scream, you ran to the pond. The ice had broken, and she was under the water. You jumped in, but it was too dark, too cold. You couldn't find her. How? Frank whispered, tears streaming down his face. How can you know this? I never told anyone the details. The police report, the newspapers, they all said it was an accident. No one knew I was supposed to be watching her. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about Dylan speaking. This was about Dylan knowing things that should have been impossible for him to know. Things that had happened decades before his birth, involving a man he'd never met. Dr. Williams appeared in the lobby, having rushed down from her office after Patricia's call. She took in the scene. Frank crying in a chair, Dylan standing calmly beside him, Marcus looking stunned, and Patricia documenting everything on her phone. What's happening here? Dr. Williams asked, but her professional composure couldn't hide her excitement. She'd been working with Dylan for 3 years, and she knew exactly how significant this breakthrough was. Dylan spoke, Marcus said simply. But that's not the strangest part. Dylan turned to Dr. Williams, and for the first time since Marcus had known him, his son smiled. Not the polite, distant expression he usually wore, but a genuine, warm smile that transformed his entire face. Hello, Dr. Williams, Dylan said, his voice now steady and clear. I've been listening to everything you've said in our appointments. I know you've been trying to help me. Dr. Williams nearly dropped her medical bag. Dylan, this is incredible. Can you tell us why you chose to speak now? Why tonight? Dylan looked back at Frank, who was still sobbing quietly. Because Frank needs to know the truth about what happened after Maria fell through the ice. About what he couldn't see in the dark water. Frank raised his head, his eyes red and swollen. What truth? She drowned. I couldn't save her. I've lived with that guilt for 31 years. She didn't drown, Dylan said quietly. When you jumped in after her. When you couldn't find her in the dark. You gave up too soon. She was trapped under a piece of the broken ice, in an air pocket. She was still breathing. Frank's entire body went rigid. No, that's not possible. The coroner said. She was breathing for almost 10 minutes after you got out of the water, Dylan continued. She called your name over and over, but you couldn't hear her. She wasn't angry, Frank. She was scared, but she wasn't angry. She knew you tried to save her. The lobby had fallen completely silent. Even the hospital's usual background noise seemed muted, as if the entire building was holding its breath. But that's not why I needed to tell you, Dylan said, reaching out to touch Frank's trembling hand. Maria wants you to know that she forgives you. She's been trying to tell you for 31 years, but you wouldn't listen. Tonight, when you smiled at me, when you spoke to me without expecting anything back, you opened your heart enough for her message to come through. Frank Rodriguez looked into Dylan Ashworth's 12-year-old eyes and saw something that defied every rational explanation. But after 31 years of carrying guilt that had eaten away at his soul, rational explanations no longer mattered. She forgives me, he whispered. Dylan nodded. She says to tell you that the construction site wasn't your fault either. The company knew the ice was thin. They knew kids played there. They were supposed to put up fences, but they didn't want to spend the money. Maria says the lawsuit your parents never filed could have saved other children. Frank's crying intensified, but something had changed in his expression. The hollow despair was being replaced by something else. Hope, relief, and a dawning understanding that his life might be about to change completely. But Dylan wasn't finished. He turned to his father, and Marcus saw something in his son's eyes that made his blood run cold. "Dad," Dylan said, "there's something about Mom's accident that you need to know." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His wife Rebecca's death had been ruled an accident. Her BMW had skidded off a rain-slicked highway during a winter storm 8 years ago. The investigation was thorough, the case closed, but the way Dylan was looking at him now, with those knowing green eyes that mirrored his mother's, suggested that everything Marcus believed about that tragic night was wrong. "Dylan, what do you mean?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible above the hospital's ambient noise. Before Dylan could answer, Patricia stepped forward, her phone still recording. "Perhaps we should move somewhere more private," she suggested, glancing around at the curious faces that had gathered in the lobby. "This conversation needs to happen away from prying eyes." Dr. Williams nodded in agreement. "The family conference room on the 3rd floor is available. It's soundproof and completely confidential." Frank Rodriguez wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve, still reeling from Dylan's revelations about his sister Maria. "I should go," he said, struggling to stand. "This is family business, and I'm just—" "No," Dylan interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible for a 12-year-old. "You need to stay, Frank. What happened to Mom is connected to what happened to Maria. They're both part of the same story." The elevator ride to the 3rd floor passed in tense silence. Marcus studied his son's profile, searching for any sign of the quiet, withdrawn boy he'd known for 12 years. This new Dylan, articulate, confident, and somehow possessed of impossible knowledge, was like meeting a stranger who happened to share his son's face. The conference room was sterile and windowless, with a polished oak table surrounded by leather chairs. Dr. Williams closed the door behind them and activated the room's privacy features, soundproofing that ensured their conversation would remain completely confidential. "Dylan," Dr. Williams began, settling into her professional role despite her obvious amazement, "what you've shared tonight defies everything we understand about human communication and memory. Can you help us understand how you know these things?" Dylan climbed into one of the oversized chairs, his feet barely touching the floor. For a moment he looked like the child he was. Then he spoke, and the illusion shattered. "I've always been able to hear them," he said simply. "The people who died with unfinished business. Their voices started when I was very young, maybe 3 or 4. At first it was just whispers, feelings, images that didn't make sense. But as I got older, the messages became clearer." Marcus felt the room spin slightly. "You're saying you can communicate with dead people?" "Not exactly communicating," Dylan corrected. "It's more like they use me as a messenger. They can't rest until certain truths are revealed, certain wrongs are acknowledged. I've been carrying their words for years, but I couldn't find a way to deliver them, until tonight." Frank leaned forward, his face still wet with tears. "You said Maria forgives me. Is she still suffering?" Dylan's expression softened. "She's been waiting for you to forgive yourself, Frank. That's what's been keeping her tied to this world. But there's more." The construction company that built those apartments, Meridian Development, they knew the ice was dangerous. They had engineering reports that warned about the unstable ground conditions, but they buried them to avoid delays. Patricia stopped recording and looked up sharply. "Meridian Development. That name sounds familiar." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. "It should. Meridian was one of my father's companies. He sold it in 1995. 2 years after the accident." The silence in the room was deafening. Frank stared at Marcus with growing understanding and horror. "Your father owned the company that killed my sister?" "I didn't know," Marcus said quickly. "I was 15 when Maria died. I had no idea my father's company was involved." Dylan nodded solemnly. "That's why Maria needed Frank to be here tonight. The connection between our families goes deeper than just business. It goes to the heart of why Mom died." Dr. Williams was frantically taking notes, her scientific mind struggling to process the supernatural elements while recognizing the very real emotional trauma unfolding before her. Dylan, can you tell us about your mother's accident? Dylan's young face grew troubled. It wasn't an accident. Mom found something in Dad's office. Documents that proved Meridian Development knew about the safety issues at multiple construction sites. Not just the one where Maria died, but dozens of others. People died because of corners that were cut, safety reports that were ignored. Marcus shook his head vigorously. That's impossible. My father sold Meridian years before I married your mother. Rebecca never had access to those old files. She did, Dylan said quietly. Because someone gave them to her. Someone who worked for your father and kept copies of everything, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. Patricia had gone very still, her phone forgotten in her lap. Dylan, who gave your mother those documents? Dylan looked directly at Frank Rodriguez. Your uncle, Thomas Rodriguez. He was Meridian's head of safety inspection. He's the one who wrote the buried reports about the ice conditions at the Pike Street site. Frank's mouth fell open. Uncle Tommy died 5 years ago, lung cancer. He worked construction his whole life, but I never knew he worked for Meridian. He kept copies of everything, Dylan continued. Reports, memos, correspondence between executives. He knew that cutting corners had killed children, but he was threatened with lawsuits, told he'd lose his pension if he ever went public. So he waited, hoping someday the truth would come out. Marcus was struggling to keep up with the implications. You're saying Thomas Rodriguez gave Rebecca evidence that my father's company was responsible for multiple deaths? Mom was going to expose everything, Dylan said. She'd contacted journalists, lawyers, and families of other victims. She was building a case that would have destroyed not just Meridian, but everyone who knew about the cover-up and stayed silent. The room fell silent as the full scope of the revelation sank in. Frank was the first to speak, his voice hollow with realization. Someone killed her to stop the story from coming out. Dylan nodded gravely. The night she died, Mom was driving to meet with a reporter from the Seattle Times. She had all of Uncle Thomas's documents with her, everything needed to prove the conspiracy, but she never made it to that meeting. Marcus felt his world collapsing around him. The police said she lost control in the rain. There were skid marks, evidence of hydroplaning. The car was tampered with, Dylan interrupted. The brake lines were partially cut, not enough to cause immediate failure, but enough to ensure they'd fail under stress. When Mom tried to slow down for the curve on Highway 18, the brakes gave out completely. Patricia was recording again, her hands shaking. Dylan, how can you possibly know these details? Because Mom is still here, Dylan said simply. She's been trying to tell the truth for 8 years, but no one could hear her. She's been waiting for me to find the courage to speak. Dr. Williams cleared her throat, her medical training warring with what she was witnessing. Dylan, from a scientific standpoint, what you're describing is impossible, Dylan finished. I know, but impossible things happen every day. The human mind, the connection between people who love each other. There's so much we don't understand about consciousness, about what happens when we die. Quote, Marcus looked at his son with new eyes, seeing not just the boy he'd raised, but a bridge between worlds, a conduit for truths that powerful people had tried to bury. Dylan, if what you're saying is true, then your mother's death wasn't random. Someone murdered her to protect a secret. Multiple someones, Dylan corrected. The cover-up involved corporate executives, city officials, even some police officers, who were paid to ensure certain investigations never happened. Frank slammed his fist on the conference table, his grief transforming into rage. 31 years. I've spent 31 years thinking I killed my sister through negligence, when the real killers were men in expensive suits who cared more about profit margins than children's lives. Uncle Thomas tried to warn people, Dylan said. After Maria died, he went to the police, but his reports disappeared. He went to the newspapers, but the stories never ran. He realized the conspiracy went deeper than just one company. Patricia looked up from her phone. Dylan, you mentioned that your mother had all these documents with her when she died. What happened to them? Dylan's expression darkened. They were removed from the car before the police arrived. Mom hid backup copies, but they were stolen from our house 3 days after the funeral. Marcus remembered that break-in. Nothing of obvious value had been taken. Jewelry, electronics, and cash were all left behind. The police had dismissed it as the work of amateur burglars who got spooked. Now he understood they'd been looking for something very specific. There's one more thing, Dylan said, his young voice carrying the weight of years of suppressed truth. Mom wasn't the only person killed to protect this secret. Over the past 8 years, 3 other people who had information about Meridian's cover-up have died in, quote, accidents. And tomorrow night, they're planning to kill again. The conference room erupted in shocked voices, but Dylan raised his hand for silence. His green eyes, so much like his mother's, fixed on his father with an intensity that seemed to burn. Dad, the person they're targeting next is someone you trust completely, someone who's been part of our family for years. Someone who's been protecting me since Mom died, but who recently discovered evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy. Marcus felt his heart stop as Dylan turned to look directly at Patricia Chen. They're coming for Patricia tomorrow night, and this time, they're not planning to make it look like an accident. Patricia Chen's face went white as every eye in the room turned toward her. She clutched her phone so tightly her knuckles showed through her skin, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "I found them last week," she said quietly. "The backup documents your mother hid, they were sewn into the lining of Dylan's baby blanket, the one she made when she was pregnant. I was repairing a tear in the fabric when I discovered the hidden compartment." Marcus stared at the woman who had been caring for his son for 8 years. "You've had evidence of Rebecca's murder for a week, and you didn't tell me?" "I was protecting Dylan," Patricia replied firmly. "These people have killed to keep their secrets. The moment I found those documents, I knew Dylan and I were both in danger. I've been trying to figure out how to expose the truth without getting us killed." Dr. Williams leaned forward, her medical training taking over. "Patricia, if you're truly in danger, we need to contact law enforcement immediately." Frank Rodriguez let out a bitter laugh. "You heard the kid. Some of the cops are part of the conspiracy. Who do you call when you can't trust the police?" Dylan stood up in his chair, his small frame somehow commanding the room's attention. "That's why Mom chose tonight. That's why she waited until Frank was here, until all the right people were in the same place at the same time." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked. "Frank's sister Maria died because of corporate negligence. Mom died because she tried to expose it. Uncle Thomas died keeping the secret that could have saved them both. But their deaths weren't meaningless if we can use the truth to prevent more deaths." Patricia opened her phone and began scrolling through photos. The documents show that Meridian Development didn't just cut corners on construction. They had a systematic pattern of bribing city inspectors, falsifying safety reports, and covering up accidents that injured or killed workers and civilians. She turned the phone toward the group, displaying images of yellowed papers covered in official letterheads and signatures. Construction sites across 3 counties, spanning 15 years. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 47 people, with hundreds more injured. Frank's voice was thick with emotion. 47 people died because of greed, quote. "The cover-up was even worse than the original crimes," Patricia continued. "When victims' families tried to file lawsuits, they faced intimidation. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses recanted their testimony or died in suspicious accidents. The conspiracy reached into law enforcement, city government, and the court system." Marcus studied the documents on Patricia's phone, recognizing his father's signature on several of the papers. The man he'd idolized, whose business empire he'd inherited and expanded, had been a murderer. "My father knew. He knew people were dying, and he paid to keep it quiet." "Your father was just one part of a larger machine," Dylan said gently. "Mom understood that. She wasn't trying to destroy our family. She was trying to save other families from going through what Frank's family went through." Dr. Williams had been unusually quiet, processing everything she'd witnessed. "Dylan, you said they're planning to kill Patricia tomorrow night. How can you possibly know their specific plans?" Dylan's expression grew troubled. "The voices of the dead aren't the only ones I can hear. Sometimes when people are planning to do terrible things, their intentions create echoes, dark thoughts that ripple outward." He turned to Patricia with an urgency that made everyone in the room tense. "They know you found the documents. Someone's been watching our house, listening to our phone calls. They know you've been researching journalists and lawyers." Patricia nodded grimly. "I suspected I was being watched. Strange cars on our street, phone calls that hung up when I answered, emails that disappeared from my inbox after I read them." "Tomorrow night, they're planning to stage a home invasion," Dylan continued. "They'll make it look like a robbery gone wrong. You'll be killed, the documents will disappear, and the case will go cold, just like all the others." Marcus felt rage building in his chest, not just at the people who had killed his wife and were now threatening Patricia, but at his own blindness. "I should have seen it. Rebecca was acting strangely in the weeks before she died. She was nervous, secretive, making phone calls she wouldn't talk about. She was trying to protect you, Dylan said. She knew that if you found out what your father had done, it would destroy you. She thought she could expose the truth and shield you from the worst of it. Frank had been listening intently, his weathered face hard with determination. So what do we do? How do we stop them? Patricia looked around the room at the unlikely group that had come together in this sterile hospital conference room. We have to go public with everything. All at once, to multiple news outlets, law enforcement agencies that aren't compromised, and social media platforms. Make it impossible for them to contain or suppress. That's exactly what Mom would have wanted, Dylan said. She believed the truth should belong to everyone, not just the people with enough money to buy silence. Dr. Williams cleared her throat. I have contacts at the FBI agents who specialize in corruption cases. They've been looking for a way to investigate what they suspect is a pattern of construction-related murders in the Pacific Northwest. And I know people too, Frank added. Workers who've been afraid to speak up, families who lost loved ones but could never prove it wasn't an accident. If the truth comes out, they'll have the courage to add their voices. Marcus pulled out his own phone, his business instincts taking over. I have resources, lawyers, security firms, media contacts. We can coordinate a simultaneous release across multiple channels. But we need to move fast. If they're planning to act tomorrow night, we have less than 24 hours. Dylan smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Marcus had seen on his son's face in years. Mom says to tell you she's proud of you, Dad. She knew you'd make the right choice when the time came. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of coordinated activity. Patricia retrieved the hidden documents from Dylan's baby blanket, revealing a treasure trove of evidence that detailed decades of corporate malfeasance and murder. Frank contacted families of other victims, building a network of witnesses ready to tell their stories. Dr. Williams reached out to federal agents, while Marcus used his wealth and connections to hire the best investigative journalists and security experts money could buy. By sunset the following day, the story was everywhere. Major newspapers ran simultaneous front-page exposés. Television networks led their evening broadcasts with breaking news about the Meridian murders. Social media exploded, with stories from families who had lost loved ones to construction accidents that were now revealed to be preventable tragedies. The arrests began that same night. City officials, police officers, corporate executives, and construction company owners were taken into custody as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. The home invasion that was supposed to silence Patricia Chen never happened. The men hired to kill her were in federal custody before they could act. 3 months later, Dylan Ashworth stood in a packed Seattle courtroom, his clear voice cutting through years of silence and secrets. He testified not about supernatural communications with the dead, but about the documents his mother had hidden, the evidence Patricia had preserved, and the courage it had taken for Frank Rodriguez to confront the truth about his sister's death. The trials would continue for 2 years. 43 people were ultimately convicted of crimes ranging from manslaughter to conspiracy to commit murder. Dozens of families received settlements that could never bring back their loved ones, but provided some measure of justice. Frank Rodriguez used his portion of the settlement to establish the Maria Rodriguez Foundation, which advocates for construction safety and supports families of workplace accident victims. He also became a regular visitor to the Ashworth household, forming an unlikely friendship with the man whose father's company had killed his sister. Patricia Chen remained with the family, but now as Dylan's advocate and spokesperson rather than just his caregiver. She helped establish protocols for investigating suspicious construction accidents and became a nationally recognized expert on corporate accountability. Dr. Williams published papers about Dylan's case that revolutionized understanding of selective mutism and trauma-induced communication disorders. She never publicly discussed the supernatural elements of Dylan's breakthrough, but she privately acknowledged that some aspects of human consciousness remained beyond scientific explanation. Marcus Ashworth liquidated his father's business empire and used the proceeds to fund construction safety initiatives and victim advocacy programs. He discovered that wealth without integrity was meaningless, but wealth used to serve justice could transform lives. And Dylan? Dylan continued to speak, but more importantly, he learned to listen, not just to voices from beyond, but to the living people around him who needed their stories heard. He never again claimed to communicate with the dead, and as the years passed, even he wasn't entirely sure what had happened that night in the hospital lobby. What mattered wasn't whether the voices Dylan heard were real or whether his knowledge came from supernatural sources. What mattered was that a 12-year-old boy found the courage to break his silence, when breaking that silence could save lives. On quiet evenings, when Dylan sat with his father watching the Seattle skyline, Marcus sometimes asked if he still heard his mother's voice. Dylan would smile and say, "She doesn't need to talk to me anymore, Dad. She knows her job is done." But late at night, when the house was still and Patricia was asleep in her room, Dylan would sometimes whisper to the darkness, "Thank you, Mom. Thank you for waiting until I was ready to speak." The response never came in words. It came in the feeling of peace that settled over the house, the sense that justice had finally been served, and the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful truths come from the most unexpected voices. Frank Rodriguez was right about one thing: the dead do rest easier when their stories are finally told. And sometimes, if we're lucky, they help the living find the courage to tell them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.